"Go ahead and keep pretending you're brave," my brother-in-law Connor said, as he closed his hand around my 10-year-old daughter's wrist. "I can put you in a hospital bed before she finishes screaming." We were standing under the bright white canopy of a youth sports fundraiser in Colorado Springs, surrounded by parents, coaches, children, and enough cell phones to record every angle of his mistake. My sister Brielle stood 6 feet away with her arms folded, not frightened, not surprised, just irritated that Connor had finally made their private cruelty public. Connor believed I was a quiet Army paperwork officer who spent her days approving supply requests and arranging training calendars. That was the version of my job I gave relatives because it was simple, and because people who loved you did not need a resume before they respected you. He did not know I was a captain in the United States Army Military Police Corps, a certified combatives instructor, and the officer my brigade used when a training scenario involved an armed aggressor, a hostage, or a room full of soldiers who needed to learn how quickly arrogance could turn into injury. More important, he did not understand that I had spent the previous 6 weeks doing everything a responsible adult was supposed to do. I had documented his threats. I had saved security footage. I had filed a police report when he destroyed my daughter's phone. I had changed the locks on my mother's old house after my sister let herself in without permission. I had told him in writing to stay off my property. I had even asked the event director to keep him away from us that afternoon. None of it mattered to Connor, because men like him do not interpret restraint as discipline. They interpret it as fear. So when he tightened his grip on Emma's wrist and smiled at me in front of the same community he had bullied for years, he thought he had finally cornered the harmless older sister he had been mocking since the day he married Brielle. What he had actually done was place his hand on a child after being warned, in public, on camera, while an army officer trained to end exactly that kind of threat stood within 2 steps of him. I looked at Emma first. Her face was pale, but she was watching me the way we had practiced, not pulling against him, not twisting her arm, keeping her feet under her. Then I looked at Connor and said, "Let go of my daughter." He laughed and turned his shoulders toward the crowd, performing for them. "Or what, Captain Clipboard?" he asked. "You'll write me up?" That was the last full sentence he managed to say while standing. 6 months earlier, Emma and I had moved into the small stucco house my mother left me on the west side of town, close enough to Fort Carson that I could make morning formation without crossing the whole city, but far enough into an older neighborhood that evenings still smelled like pine and charcoal grills instead of exhaust. I was 32, recently divorced, and tired of temporary apartments with beige walls and neighbors who changed every season. The house was not impressive. The porch leaned slightly toward the street. The kitchen cabinets were older than I was, and the backyard had a patch of stubborn dirt where nothing grew except one determined sunflower Emma planted from a school packet. But it was ours. And after 3 deployments and a marriage that ended quietly, rather than dramatically, I wanted ordinary things. I wanted to know which floorboard creaked outside Emma's room. I wanted her artwork on walls I did not have to repaint before moving. I wanted Saturday mornings where my biggest decision was pancakes or eggs. Brielle had married Connor Vance 3 years earlier. He owned Vance Performance Center, a glossy boxing and fitness gym built inside a converted auto dealership near Memorial Park. His father, Douglas Vance, owned Sentinel Ridge Security, a regional company that guarded warehouses, office parks, and construction sites. Douglas talked about his business as though he commanded an army, and Connor repeated every sentence with more volume and less understanding. They liked to describe themselves as self-made, even though Douglas had financed the gym, paid the down payment on Connor and Brielle's house, and covered every month when Connor's membership numbers fell short. Brielle loved the appearance of success. When we were children, she borrowed my sweaters without asking. As an adult, she borrowed entire identities. Around military families, she called herself resilient. Around gym owners, she became a wellness entrepreneur. Around Douglas, she laughed at jokes she once would have called cruel. I still loved her, but by then, loving my sister felt like carrying a glass bowl across an icy parking lot. I kept both hands on it and expected the ground to shift. The first trouble started with my mother's detached garage. Brielle still had an old key, and one afternoon Emma and I came home to find 12 heavy punching bags, stacks of rubber flooring, and boxes of promotional shirts packed from wall to wall. Connor had lost a storage lease and decided family property was free. I called Brielle. She said, "It's temporary, Nat. Connor has a tournament next month. I told her they had until Sunday to remove everything. She sighed, as though I were creating a problem instead of ending one. Connor arrived that evening in a lifted pickup, brought 3 employees, and made sure every bag scraped the garage frame on the way out. Before leaving, he stood in my driveway and said, "You know, most people would be grateful to help family." I answered, "Most people ask before entering someone else's property." His smile changed by half an inch. It was the first time he realized I would not automatically yield because Brielle had chosen him. 2 days later, at a Sunday lunch Douglas hosted for the family, Connor turned the garage dispute into entertainment. He told my aunts that I had become military dramatic and claimed officers were trained to create rules because they could not handle real life without someone saluting them. Brielle laughed too loudly. When one of my uncles asked what I actually did at Fort Carson, I said I worked in military police operations and left it there. Connor raised his glass and said, "So, parking tickets with camouflage." I did not correct him. My daughter watched me across the table, waiting to see whether dignity required an argument. I changed the subject and asked my uncle about his knee surgery. Connor mistook that choice for surrender, but Emma understood it. On the drive home, she asked why I had let him make fun of me. I told her, "You do not have to answer every person who gets you wrong. Sometimes the safest thing is to let them keep advertising who they are." She nodded, then asked whether Uncle Connor was a bad person. I said people were responsible for patterns, not labels, and that we would judge his next choice when it arrived. It arrived quickly. After that, Connor began testing every boundary he could reach without quite crossing into something he thought would bring consequences. He parked gym vans across the mouth of my driveway during weekend events. He sent clients down our street on urban conditioning runs and encouraged them to use porch steps, retaining walls, and public benches as obstacles. He laughed when an elderly neighbor asked them to stop cutting through her garden. He told a 16-year-old employee that real men did not complain when the boy asked for overdue wages. I watched, recorded dates, and stayed out of arguments that did not require me. My work had taught me that patterns mattered more than single incidents. A threat rarely began with the worst act. It began with a small violation, then another, each one designed to discover who would object and how much resistance they could tolerate. Connor interpreted the neighborhood's politeness as permission. The first time he directly targeted Emma happened on a Saturday in May. She was sitting on our front steps, filming a short video for a school media project about local businesses. Connor had stopped his truck beside the curb and was screaming at the teenage employee about missing gym towels. Emma's camera caught his voice and part of his face. He noticed, marched across the sidewalk, and demanded her phone. She told him it was her property and backed toward the front door. He snatched it from her hand, held it above his head, and said, "Kids who spy on adults lose their toys." Then he bent the phone against the metal porch rail until the screen fractured in a white spiderweb. I reached the doorway before he could drop it. I did not touch him. I told Emma to go inside. Then I took a photograph of Connor holding the damaged phone. He smirked. "Send me the bill," he said. "Maybe I'll pay it when you learn some manners." I called the police while he was still standing there. That surprised him more than anger would have. The responding officer took statements, photographed the phone, and explained that because the value exceeded the local misdemeanor threshold and because Connor had taken it from a child's hand, the report would be forwarded for review. Brielle arrived before the officer left and immediately asked why I was trying to ruin her husband's life over a piece of plastic. Emma heard her. I saw it in the way my daughter's shoulders folded inward, as if she had become an inconvenience in her own family. That hurt more than the phone. I told Brielle, "He frightened your niece, took her property, and broke it in front of her. You are asking the wrong person to make this disappear." She looked toward Connor, then back at me. "You've always needed to prove you're tougher than everyone," she said. I almost laughed because toughness had nothing to do with it. The hardest thing I had done all year was keep my hands at my sides while a grown man terrified my child. I changed the locks that afternoon, sent Connor a written no trespass notice, installed 2 cameras, and gave copies of the police report to my attorney on base. I did not threaten him. I simply removed the opportunities he had been using. By June, the Vance family had decided the problem was not Connor's conduct, but my refusal to absorb it. Douglas invited me to dinner at a steakhouse near the Broadmoor and chose a private booth where he could lower his voice and pretend intimidation was negotiation. Brielle sat beside him. Connor stayed home, which told me the meeting had been planned as a business conversation rather than a family one. Douglas wore a silver watch the size of a compass and kept tapping it against the table whenever he wanted to emphasize a point. He said Sentinel Ridge was preparing a proposal for a multi-year civilian guard services contract supporting several facilities connected to Fort Carson. He had heard I worked in operations and assumed I could smooth out misunderstandings. I told him I had no role in procurement and would not discuss Army business with him. Then he slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a check for the replacement cost of Emma's phone and a short statement for me to sign saying the damage had been accidental. I pushed it back. Douglas's expression hardened. "You are making enemies you cannot afford," he said. "My company employs more people than your little unit," I answered. "Then you should understand why accurate records matter." Brielle stared at the table. I waited for her to say something, not because I needed rescue, but because some stubborn part of me still hoped my sister had a line she would not let them cross. Douglas leaned closer and said he knew senior officers, city officials, and people in Washington. He said one complaint about instability, aggression, or poor judgment could stall an Army career. A single mother should be careful about creating questions around her fitness, he added. That was the moment Brielle finally spoke. She did not defend me. She said, "Natalie, just sign it." Connor was embarrassed. Emma got scared. Everybody overreacted. "Why do you always have to turn everything into a campaign?" I looked at my sister and understood that the relationship I was protecting existed only in my memory. She was not trapped between us. She had chosen a side and wanted me to make the choice painless for her. I folded the statement once, placed it back in the envelope, and said, "Do not contact my command. Do not contact Emma. Do not come to my house. Any future communication goes through my attorney." Douglas smiled without warmth. "You think a uniform makes you untouchable?" he asked. "No," I said. "I think evidence makes lies harder." I left enough cash for my meal and walked out. That night I sat with Emma on the back steps while rain tapped against the metal awning. She asked whether Aunt Brielle was mad at us. I told her adults sometimes protect the life they want instead of the people they love, and that none of it was Emma's fault. Then I showed her how to activate the emergency call on her new phone without unlocking the screen. We practiced where to move if someone grabbed her wrist, how to make noise, how to describe clothing and vehicles, and when to run instead of argue. I did not teach her to fight Connor. I taught her that asking for help was not weakness, and that being related to someone did not give them ownership over her boundaries. The fundraiser at Memorial Park took place 3 weeks later. It was supposed to raise money for after-school sports programs, and Vance Performance Center was one of the sponsors. I had volunteered at the registration tent because Emma's school was participating, but I notified the event director about the no-contact issue before we arrived. She assigned a security volunteer to stay near the children's activity area and told Connor not to approach us. For the first hour, everything went well. Emma helped younger kids decorate water bottles. A local fire crew demonstrated rescue equipment. Coaches rotated through short clinics on soccer, wrestling, basketball, and track. Then Connor saw that people were avoiding his booth. Word about the phone incident had spread, and 2 parents had pulled their children from his gym. He began drinking from a metal flask he thought nobody noticed. By noon he was performing loud mitt drills in the center of the grass, punching harder than necessary and glancing toward my tent after every combination. I ignored him. That made him louder. Finally, he took a microphone from one of the assistants and announced that the fundraiser needed a real demonstration instead of government employees handing out brochures. He called my name. I stayed seated. He laughed and told the crowd, I had filed a police report because I was afraid to settle a family disagreement face to face. A few people looked uncomfortable. Others lifted their phones. The event director walked toward him and asked for the microphone. Connor stepped away, pointed at me and said, "Come on, Captain. 1 minute in the ring. Show everybody what the Army taught you." I answered clearly enough for nearby cameras to hear, "I am not participating. Stay away from me and my daughter." The refusal should have ended it. Instead, he walked toward our tent. The security volunteer blocked him, and Connor shoved the man aside with his forearm. Emma immediately took out her phone and began recording. Connor saw it. His face tightened with the same expression he had worn on our porch. He lunged across the folding table, scattered registration forms, and caught Emma by the wrist before she could step back. That was where the story had begun, with his threat hanging over the field and my sister watching him hold my child. I gave him one direct order to release her. He responded by pulling Emma toward him and raising his other hand as if to strike the phone away. I moved. My left hand secured his thumb and wrist. My right forearm separated his grip from Emma, and I turned my body so she passed behind me, instead of falling. Connor swung at my head with the hand I had released. I slipped outside the punch, caught his elbow, and guided his momentum across the table. He crashed chest first onto the padded edge, bounced backward, and came at me again. I heard someone calling 911. I heard the event director yelling for children to move away. Connor threw a wide right hook, then reached for my throat when it missed. I stepped inside his balance, trapped the arm against my shoulder, and used a controlled hip turn that put him on the grass without driving his head into the ground. He rolled and tried to rise. I placed one knee beside his shoulder, not on his spine, controlled both wrists, and told him, "Stop resisting. Police are coming." He cursed, kicked, and tried to bite my forearm. I shifted my weight and held him until two off-duty deputies working the event reached us. The entire physical exchange lasted less than 20 seconds. It was not a match. It was not revenge. It was a removal of his hands from my daughter and a restraint until law enforcement took over. When the deputies cuffed him, Connor shouted that I had attacked him because of the police report. 12 people immediately offered video. One of them was Mrs. Alvarez, the neighbor whose flower bed Connor's runners had trampled for months. She had always lowered her eyes when he passed, but now she stepped forward with her phone held in both hands and said, "I recorded from the first shove." The teenage employee Connor had humiliated at the curb was there with his mother. He told a deputy that Connor had warned staff they would lose their jobs if they ever contradicted him. A soccer coach who rented space at the gym admitted he had seen Connor threaten young athletes before. It was as if the field had been holding its breath for years, and Emma's raised phone finally gave everyone permission to exhale. That mattered to me almost as much as the arrest. I did not want my daughter to remember 40 adults watching while a bully controlled the truth. I wanted her to remember ordinary people choosing, one after another, to stop being silent. The deputies separated witnesses so their statements would not contaminate one another, and each account led back to the same facts. Connor had ignored the event director, shoved security, seized a child, threatened me, and thrown the first punch. There was no dramatic debate, and no officer dazzled by the Vance name. There were simply videos, timestamps, visible injuries, and witnesses who had finally decided accuracy was worth the inconvenience. 12 people immediately offered video. The security volunteer showed the red mark where Connor had shoved him. Emma's recording captured my warning, Connor's threat, his grip on her wrist, and his first punch. Brielle pushed through the crowd and screamed at me for humiliating her husband. Emma stood beside me, rubbing her wrist, and said in a voice steadier than mine felt, "Mom told him to let go." Brielle looked at her niece and still chose Connor. "You shouldn't have been filming adults," she snapped. That sentence ended whatever remained between us. I put my arm around Emma and turned away, while the deputies read Connor his rights. The fallout did not happen like a movie explosion. It happened the way real consequences usually happen, through paperwork, phone calls, interviews, and doors closing one at a time. Connor was charged with assault, criminal mischief related to the phone, and interference with the event security volunteer. A judge issued a temporary protective order covering both Emma and me. His gym's insurer suspended coverage for youth contact programs pending investigation, and the school district canceled its partnership because the incident occurred at a children's fundraiser. Parents withdrew. Coaches who had tolerated Connor's behavior began speaking openly about unpaid wages, unsafe sparring practices, and pressure to keep injured teenagers training. None of that came from me. Once people saw that one person had documented him and survived saying no, they found their own voices. Douglas reacted exactly as I expected. He called my brigade headquarters and claimed I had used military training to assault a civilian. He sent a longer complaint to the Inspector General. Those actions were legal. Citizens are allowed to complain. My command opened a preliminary inquiry, as it should have, and I turned over the protective order, the police reports, the event videos, and the written notice telling Connor to avoid us. I did not ask anyone to protect my reputation. I asked them to examine the same evidence available to everyone else. 3 soldiers who worked for me were interviewed about my judgment and temperament. The event director gave a statement. The off-duty deputies supplied body camera footage. Within 12 days, the inquiry found that I had used proportionate force to protect a child and had immediately surrendered control of Connor to law enforcement. My brigade commander called me into his office, closed the door, and said, "You did exactly what we teach, Captain. You tried distance, reporting, witnesses, and de-escalation. When those failed, you stopped the threat and stopped using force when the threat was controlled." I thanked him, but the relief I felt was not about my career. It was about knowing Emma would not grow up hearing that her mother had been punished for believing her. His mistake came afterward. He left a recorded voicemail for the event director saying that Sentinel Ridge Security would withdraw financial support from city programs unless she changed her statement. Then he contacted a retired colonel who served as a consultant on his Fort Carson proposal and demanded that the man make the Army girl disappear. The retired colonel refused and forwarded the message to council. Because Sentinel Ridge was competing for a contract requiring trusted access to military facilities, the contracting office opened a formal responsibility review focused on business integrity, witness interference, and Douglas's attempts to use the proposal as leverage in a personal dispute. I was not part of that review. The moment legal counsel learned about the family connection, I was instructed not to communicate with anyone involved in the procurement, and I followed that order. Douglas's proposal was eventually rejected, not because he insulted me and not because the Army wanted revenge, but because the company could not demonstrate the judgment and integrity required for the work. The Suspension and Debarment Office also began a separate inquiry. His company did not vanish overnight. He still had private clients and functioning contracts. But the expansion loan tied to the Fort Carson award was withdrawn, 2 investors stepped back, and the authority he had waved in my face became much smaller once people examined how he used it. Brielle came to my house 2 months after the fundraiser. She stood outside the new locked gate because the protective order prevented Connor from being near the property, and she asked me to submit a statement saying he was not a danger. She said the gym might close and Douglas blamed her for bringing our family into his life. She said Connor was attending anger management classes and had been under pressure. I listened through the intercom. Then I walked outside, but stayed on my side of the gate. Brielle looked thinner than before, and for one dangerous second I saw the girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. She said, "You already won, Nat. What else do you want?" I answered, "I want Emma to know that when someone hurts her, I will not erase the truth to make that person comfortable." Brielle began to cry. I did not. She asked whether I was choosing a police report over my sister. I told her, "You made me choose between protecting my daughter and protecting your husband from consequences. That was never a choice." She left without saying goodbye. By early winter, the criminal case ended with a plea agreement. Connor admitted to assaulting the security volunteer and damaging Emma's phone, accepted probation, paid restitution, completed a court-ordered intervention program, and agreed to stay away from youth coaching during the probation period. The prosecutor reduced the charge involving Emma after consulting us because she did not want to testify in open court, and I supported that decision. Justice was supposed to make her safer, not turn her into a permanent exhibit in someone else's punishment. Vance Performance Center remained open in a smaller building under a new manager after Douglas stopped covering its losses. Connor's name came off the front sign. Sentinel Ridge lost the Fort Carson competition, but continued guarding commercial properties while the federal inquiry moved at the slow speed. Federal inquiries often move. Brielle moved into an apartment across town. I heard through a cousin that she and Connor had separated, but I did not call to confirm it. Not every ending requires reunion. Some relationships end because one person finally stops volunteering to be injured. Emma's wrist healed within days. The fear took longer. For a while, she checked the porch camera before stepping outside and flinched whenever a large truck slowed near our house. We met with a counselor who worked with military families, and I let Emma decide when she wanted to return to the park. The first time she did, she brought her new phone but kept it in her pocket. We walked past the field where Connor had grabbed her, and she asked whether I had known I could take him down. I told her yes. She asked why I had waited so long. I said, Because being able to hurt someone does not mean hurting them is the first answer. The first answer is distance, then witnesses, then help. You use force only when the danger leaves you no other safe choice. She thought about that and nodded. A few weeks later, her class gave presentations on civic responsibility. Emma stood in front of 24 students and spoke about documenting bullying, telling trusted adults, and why family members must follow the same rules as everyone else. She never mentioned Connor's name. She did not need to. That evening we returned home to the little stucco house with the leaning porch and the sunflower stalks dry from the cold. I made grilled cheese while Emma spread homework across the kitchen table. Outside, snow began collecting along the gate I had installed after the first police report. It was not a fortress. It was simply a clear boundary with a latch that worked. Emma looked up from her worksheet and asked whether Aunt Brielle might come back someday. I told her people can change, but change has to arrive before trust, not instead of it. Then she asked whether I regretted what happened at the fundraiser. I looked at the faint yellow mark still fading from her wrist and said, "I regret that he touched you. I do not regret stopping him." She smiled, returned to her homework, and the house settled around us with the ordinary sounds I had wanted from the beginning. Connor had believed my quiet life meant I was weak. Douglas had believed money could rewrite evidence. Brielle had believed love required me to surrender my daughter's safety for her comfort. They were all wrong for the same reason. They thought restraint was the absence of power. What they never understood was that restraint is power under control, and once they forced me to choose between keeping the peace and protecting my child, the choice had already been made.